In 1948, the American sociologist Everett Hughes traveled to post-war Germany to investigate how a civilized public could live alongside the memory of systemic atrocity. Hughes discovered that these atrocities relied on agents acting under the unconscious mandate of the good people, citizens who authorized state violence while deliberately avoiding any knowledge of its execution. The journalist Eyal Press argues that this dynamic is a fundamental engine of modern society. He defines dirty work not by physical grime, but by moral injury. Press outlines 4 criteria. First, the work causes substantial harm. Second, society deems it degrading, keeping it hidden. Third, it inflicts severe moral injury on the worker. Finally, the system relies on our tacit authorization to ensure it stays invisible. This suggests that the ability to maintain clean hands depends on a sophisticated architecture of distance, one that deliberately hides the severe moral cost of our social order behind the unseen labor of others. The philosopher Michel Foucault observed that modern society did not eliminate violence and physical punishment. It simply moved it behind closed doors to protect the sensibilities of the public. In the United States, this dynamic accelerated after the 1963 Community Mental Health Act. The push to close psychiatric hospitals, combined with a rise in punitive justice, inadvertently transformed the prison system into the country's new mental asylums. Florida, under Governor Rick Scott, offers a clear case study of this transformation. These records show a 153% spike in Florida's mentally ill inmate population between 1996 and 2014. Simultaneously, the state executed a 40% budget cut to the correctional department. For the workers on the floor, this meant 12-hour shifts dealing with a highly vulnerable population, while starting salaries remained stagnant at $28,000 a year. Professionals inside these facilities face what is known as dual loyalty, an impossible psychological conflict between a therapeutic mandate to heal and a punitive mandate to punish. The sociologist Irving Goffman categorized prisons as total institutions. In these environments, workers perform people work, a process that systematically strips individuals of their autonomy and converts human beings into manageable human materials. To survive the reality of managing these materials, guards describe having to apply emotional band-aids. They armor themselves to ensure the inmates cannot penetrate their empathy, essentially shutting off their own humanity to get through the shift. This constant armoring often leads to physiological and moral breakdown. The workforce suffers from disproportionate rates of severe hypertension and depression, while the environment breeds systemic violence, as seen in the case of Darren Rainey, an inmate with schizophrenia who was tortured to death by guards. Spatial isolation does not solve societal dysfunction. It concentrates the resulting moral trauma onto an underpaid, invisible labor force. You might assume that placing digital distance between the worker and the violence would reduce this toll. The extreme distance of modern drone warfare tests that theory. The military recruits heavily for drone operators from rural towns. These are often high school graduates seeking economic mobility, stationed at terminals thousands of miles from the battlefield. Yet, remote killing causes profound trauma. High-resolution feeds force operators to loiter over targets for days, making them observe the intimate human aftermath of a strike, watching families gather the remains of the dead. When these operators speak out about their moral injury, they face a severe political double bind. The political left frequently categorizes them as war criminals, while the right dismisses them as weak traitors complaining from the safety of an air-conditioned room. The psychological insult was compounded when the military proposed a Distinguished Warfare Medal for drone operators, an award critics mocked as the Nintendo Game Medal, dismissing the actual PTSD these remote workers experience. This concept of technological distance extends into the civilian tech sector, governing the invisible labor of algorithmic moderation and data supply chains. The physicist Ursula Franklin provides a framework for this. She distinguishes between holistic technology, where a craftsman controls the entire process, and prescriptive technology. Prescriptive technology fragments labor into tiny, isolated steps. It ensures workers only see a narrow, amoral technical benchmark. By slicing the work into microtasks, the system hides the moral consequence of the final product from the people building it. Technological distance does not absolve complicity. It optimizes the worker's suffering while preserving the moral purity of the end user. When Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906, the public was outraged by the exploitation of slaughterhouse workers. Today, modern exposés of the meat industry primarily trigger public concern over animal cruelty and food safety, while the laborers themselves are often ignored. U.S. poultry consumption tripled between 1960 and 2019. Meeting that demand requires a specific workforce, often drawn from populations like the 1.6 million undocumented immigrants living in Texas. Lawrence Wright calls these vulnerable demographics the shadow people, a population required to absorb the physical and moral hazards of our consumer demands. Inside a Texas live hang room, these workers face a brutal reality. They stand on the line, attaching panicked birds to shackles heading for an electric stunner, processing up to 65 birds every minute. Labor advocates describe this as a form of plantation capitalism. The constant threat of deportation prevents workers from protesting denied bathroom breaks, severe repetitive strain injuries, or the psychological toll of continuous slaughter. The offload is environmental too. A single standard slaughterhouse produces 150 kilograms of nitrogen daily, the equivalent of a small town's untreated sewage, pumping it directly into the marginalized communities where these workers live. We see the exact same logic applied to the fossil fuel industry, revealing the broader economic rationale for accepting these hazards. The economist William Nordhaus built models arguing that steady economic growth and technological advancement eventually solve environmental problems. This theory justifies severe human risks today for the sake of market expansion tomorrow. You can see this calculus in the differing public reactions to oil spills. When an offshore platform explodes near wealthy California communities, residents mobilize in ecological outrage. In southern Louisiana, the economically dependent local population largely accepts the hazard as the requisite cost of survival. Dirty work is not distributed randomly. It is a structural weapon, geographically and demographically deployed to exploit the economically vulnerable. Professor Li Yu-Hui has spent 15 years researching generational shifts in workplace values, and her findings point to a distinct shift in how young workers define their labor. Young workers have expanded the term dirty work to include existentially meaningless tasks, repetitive labor that induces a sense of overqualification and wasted potential. This evolving definition reflects a rational response to current macroeconomic conditions. In an era of global uncertainty, the long-term corporate narratives of past decades have largely failed this generation. Because the long-term payoff is entirely unreliable, young workers demand immediate, transparent feedback loops to justify the expenditure of their finite time. The acceptable timeline for career advancement has compressed. Remaining stagnant in a role for 6 months is no longer viewed as paying your dues. It is an existential threat to their long-term career viability. In response, researchers are pushing organizations to adopt value transparency protocols. This dashboard concept visualizes exactly how daily, foundational tasks directly link to the organization's macro impact. By turning invisible administrative labor into a visible, dynamic metric, organizations close the feedback loop, helping to resolve the feeling of meaninglessness. This semantic shift is a systemic rejection of the traditional unconscious mandate. It is a generation flatly refusing to perform invisible labor. The sociologist Norbert Elias argued in The Civilizing Process that our entire modern society is architected upon pushing the unsavory mechanisms of our survival into the background. We hide the mess to feel civilized, but hiding the mess requires human shock absorbers. As Primo Levi wrote in The Drowned and the Saved, examining the gray zone of systemic oppression, there is an ethical imperative to stop judging the people pushed into the lowest tiers of these systems. The psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, in his work with combat veterans, concluded that the only proven cure for moral injury is publicization. Private therapy for the worker ultimately fails to solve the root problem. The burden of guilt cannot be resolved in isolation. It requires a public reckoning from the exact society that mandated the work in the first place. Individual, isolated consumer choices, buying an electric car, or selecting premium organic meat, might ease a personal conscience, but they do nothing to dismantle the overarching architecture of dirty work. Restructuring this moral toll demands collective recognition. It requires tearing down the legal and physical walls of secrecy and making an uncompromising demand for transparent value in all labor.